Yo! Lifelong Learner Blueroot here with episode 7 of the Azure AZ-104 exam prep series, Managing Azure Resources with Azure CLI. Thanks for tuning in. In this episode, we're going to accomplish the same objectives as the last episode, but with Azure CLI instead of using Azure PowerShell. I mentioned in the last episode that there is a way to set up Azure CLI on your local machine and link it to your Azure subscription, but we will not be setting that up and using that in this video. Here in this video, we will be executing our commands in the Cloud Shell but with Bash, which uses the same syntax as Azure CLI. With that said, the objectives that we will accomplish in this video are to start a Bash session in Azure Cloud Shell, create a resource group and an Azure Managed Disk with Azure CLI, and then configure that Managed Disk with Azure CLI. So, with that being said, let's get right into it. We will continue to use the Azure Cloud Shell here in the Azure portal. If you followed along in the previous episode, then you already have a storage account created and mounted to the Azure Cloud Shell and can successfully boot up the Cloud Shell within a minute. Since we want to simulate working with the Azure CLI, make sure to swap the PowerShell terminal over to a Bash terminal if it's not already done so. We will be doing the exact same thing as we did in the previous episode, but with Bash instead of PowerShell. So, if you remember, the first thing done was to grab the location of the previous resource group and assign it to a variable. So in Bash, I'll explain this command in just a second. If I remember correctly, this is it. Yeah, so here we're grabbing the Azure resource group and we're going to show some sort of value from this resource group. We're going to address the resource group by name, episode 6 resource group, and the query we're grabbing is the location, and we're spitting it out into this variable called location. Next, we will create another variable for our resource group name, and we're going to call it episode 7 resource group. Now let's go ahead and put the pieces together and actually create this resource group with the variables we just created. So in Bash, the syntax to create a new resource group is simply AZ group create name, and then simply use the variable we just created. And then for location, simply use the location variable. And don't forget to put the $sign in front of the variable name to designate that you are using a variable. And there you go. It succeeded in creating a new resource group under the name episode 7 resource group in the location Canada Central, which is the same location as my previous resource group, episode 6 resource group. In Bash, instead of using the create command, you can actually use the show command to retrieve properties of a resource or a resource group. So this command here, azgroup show, simply retrieves the name of this resource group. Let's move on to create the managed disk in Bash. This managed disk is going to have the same parameters and parameter values as the disks we created in the previous episode. The syntax in Bash is different though, and you'll see exactly what I mean. Let's start off with the disk name variable. We'll keep it simple like the other episodes. Now in Bash, to create the Azure disk, it's simply AZ disk create, and then the parameters. I typed out lard. Okay, you could tell in this command which parameter values are variables or not, whether or not if they start with the $sign. Then the SKU in Azure is just going to be standard LRS for this disk. And then the size is just going to be 32 gigs. This should only take a few seconds. And there you go. The disk was created successfully. So we made it pretty far with Bash. Let's go back into the Azure portal and make sure that everything actually is being created. So let's just minimize the Bash terminal. Hop over to resource groups. Okay, so our resource group episode 7 did get created. And there's the disk that we just created with the correct variables that we assigned it. Perfect. Assume you made a mistake when creating the disk and needed to increase the size from 32 gigs to 64. We can easily get that done in our bash session within the Cloud Shell. So to update a parameter, we could simply use the Azure disk update command. We called the variable for resource group name, just RG name. We had a variable for disk name as well. And then the variable that we want to update is the disk size, which is now going to be 64. And of course, after making this change, let's just run another command for demonstration purposes to verify that the change took place. So we could type in AZ disk show. Resource group, same variables. And the query we're running is to grab the disk size. And there you go. It grabbed 64, which is what we just upgraded it to. And that's the end of episode 7. You now know the basics of provisioning, deploying, and managing Azure resources by using the Azure portal, Azure ARM templates, Azure PowerShell, and now after this video, Azure CLI. They all get the job done, but feel free to utilize your preference the most in the real world. But for the Azure AZ-104 exam, it's critical to know the basics of all 4 options. If you followed this video, you have started a bash session in Azure Cloud Shell, created a resource group and an Azure Managed Disk with Azure CLI, and then configured that managed disk in Azure CLI. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video or if it helped you even in the slightest, please like and maybe subscribe for future content. Additionally, if you have any suggestions or questions, please leave a comment down below and I'll be happy to help out any possible way I can. I'll see you guys in episode 8, where we will implement virtual networking. Peace!